Hello, this is Troy Harman, and I'm going to be speaking to you today on Lincoln's visit to Gettysburg, which will culminate in his Gettysburg Address. We're going to look at his stay in the David and Catherine Wills home, his participation in the walk from the train station up to the Wills home, his participation in a funerary procession that would lead to the cemetery to help dedicate it with his famous speech. And we're going to do all of that with a lot of it's going to be a lot of human interest. I'm going to bring in some of the townspeople so you'll get to know them. There are a lot of visuals that should be very educational. I'm really looking forward to presenting this to you. And anyway, as we go through this, there's going to be a central theme that will come out, and it is Lincoln's visit, but within the overall milieu of a national impulse. And that'll make sense as we go along. Officially, we're titling this Wills and Lincoln, Life in a Northern Town. And you can see a signpost there of the David Wills House, which is run by the National Park Service and is open regular hours when things are regular during the course of the year. It's right on the town square. So, what are the common threads in a northern town in the 1860s? I've bulleted three: modernism, Victorian culture, and nationalism. And they'll make sense as we go along today. I'll present and identify all three of these threads throughout the presentation to make clearly the underlying dynamics that held together northern towns in the middle 19th century. So Lincoln would stay with David Wills. So who was David Wills? He was 33 years old in 1863. Lived there with his wife Catherine and their three girls, and a fourth child was on the way. They purchased the house that Lincoln would stay in 1859, just 4 years earlier, and turned it into a single family dwelling. This is the 1858 Adams County map, and you can see the town square right there in the middle, and the roads extending out in all directions from it. It would be on one of those corners, near one of those corners, close to the southeastern corner where the Wills house would be. And this is from a model that you can visit in the Wills house today. And you can see it's on the first floor when you make your visit there. And you can see it's 3 stories. It was originally built by Alexander Cockburn in Federalist architecture between 1814 and 1816. And Cockburn would want to use it for various things. He used it as a dry goods store. He sold queensware there, which was a form of ceramics. Um, Notions, which were all kinds of buttons and hooks that you would put on your clothing. He sold tobacco and dry beans, straw hats, bonnets, things like that. Before department stores, there were what were known as dry goods stores. Here's a modern view of it, beautifully restored. The Wills house is on the right, and then on the left, you can see the Tyson Wills house. That was built by the Wills family shortly after they purchased the main house. They tore down a structure that had once been to the left of the main Wills house, and then they built that brick structure that you see. We call it the Tyson Wills house because they rented it out to the Tysons, who were photographers and photographed the town at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, mostly thereafter. And so they rented a portion of that building. We call it the Tyson Wills house, but really it's just another Wills house. But this is reflective of the entrepreneurial spirit of people in the 19th century. And since I'm talking about a national impulse, that's part of the national impulse of Gettysburg that was common wherever Lincoln might go at that time. People were very entrepreneurial. They were starting up all kinds of businesses. We call it the market economy. It would eventually evolve into capitalism, full blown capitalism, by the end of the 19th century. So people that were on the make, the idea of self improvement, self help was watchwords at the time, and the Wills certainly were people trying to improve themselves. Now, this is inside the Wills house. Let's go through a brief tour. You can see a Federalist elliptic fan window. Remember that. We're going to bring that design up again at the end of our presentation. And you're in the vestibule. That's where you would enter today to tour the house. And in the time of Lincoln's visit, the interior had been updated to Victorian culture. That's all part of this national impulse. You know, originally the house had been built as a Federalist house, but it would be just like you buying a house today in from the 1980s or 1990s, and then you update it with modern conveniences on the inside to reflect 2020 or 2021. The same could be said of the Wills. They took this 1816 house and modernized it and turned it into an 1860s Victorian culture house. The vestibule where you walk in for Victorian houses is where men would put their top hats, where women would hang their shawls, and it was a room within a room where and if no one was home, this is where you left your calling card, which was kind of an ID card at the time. But this would be a little separate entrance before you went into the main house. And as you walk through the house today, you can see York Street at the bottom of the screen. That's where we entered. See the entrance foyer. That's where we just were with the elliptical fan window. Over to the left, there's tickets and a gift shop. Today, I'll talk about what were in those rooms here in just a minute. But off to the right, we're going to be visiting the a gallery, which was the parlor at the time. And on the upper right-hand corner, you can see the Wills Law Office. We'll be visiting that too. One of the things I want you to notice as we go through the house is how partitioned Victorians' houses were. They didn't have open rooms, studio apartments. The idea of rancher houses where partitions were broken down between the kitchen, the dining room, the living room, the den, that would come about in the 1930s as a popular form of house design based on women having the vote. Once women had the vote, partitions went down. Partitions were about separating people based on gender and age. Victorian people were very dividing in their spaces, and Victorian houses very much reflect that. So our first room was the entrance foyer off of York Street. Now we're going to go into the area. It says tickets, gift shop, and information. This is what it would look like today. It's where you buy your ticket to go through the house. You can see a picture of David and Catherine there. And if you go into the house today, we have, depending on the day, people portraying one or both of these good folks. And we believe at the time of Lincoln's visit, it was a music room. So that would have entailed a piano with crepe or dressing across the legs. Victorian people were very prim and proper. They didn't want limbs, even if they were wooden limbs, uncovered. So they would cover them. So you would have seen a white crepe, netted crepe around the legs. There would have been cases that would hold in compartments that would hold music. There would have been possibly a statue, a little bust up on the fire mantle of Bach or Beethoven. That was not uncommon at the time. Sheet music lying around. The three girls would have come in there and sang at different times in all likelihood. So the music room today is where you buy your tickets. Now this is the parlor. This would be to the right when you came in off of York Street. It's the next room over from the music room. And the parlor was the one room that Victorian culture opened up to guests. This is where you kept the family heirlooms and the nicest treasures that you owned. So your horsehair couch would be here. Your nice mantelpieces would be in a room like this, and certainly the finest furniture that you had would be on display for guests to see. Parlor was the one room that wasn't partitioned off to separate people based on any kind of division. Rather, it was an all-inclusive place. Here's another view of the same parlor, and you can see the marble mantle. Um, if you went through the house, you'd find that there are wooden mantles in other rooms. Originally, there would have been wooden mantles, but marble mantles would be saved for the nicest room, the one that you wanted to show off for your guest. We know of a wedding that occurred here in 1889 with, it was a double wedding. Two of the Wills daughters were married in this room. Jenny Wills Quimby was one of them, and she's the one that drew up the maps that showed what was in each room so we can kind of roughly create it interpretively, um, and 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 be able to explain that to the general public. You can see the marble fireplace. Try to imagine the two daughters there being married. Try to imagine the two grooms beside them. The Presbyterian minister. The Wills belonged to the local Presbyterian church. The newspapers talked about the house being filled up with beautiful piano music. That would have probably come from the music room to your left. And there was a limited number of people allowed in the room for the wedding. But then they opened the doors to the right, which you can't really see from this view, out onto the town square, and the music sort of flowed out into the streets, and then people were invited back in for a reception, and there would have been dozens and dozens of people that would have gone through. It would have been a very proud moment for the Wills family. It would have been one of those signature moments. Victorian houses also showed off floor coverings. If you were part of the rising middle class in the 19th century, as defined in the West as the rise of the middle class, thanks to industrialization, people finding their way up, picking themselves up by their bootstraps, investing in all kinds of entrepreneurial designs to try to climb the social ladder. If you wanted to show that off or display it, you put floor covering in. And that distinguished you from the poor dirt farmer who had a dirt floor or no covering on their floor. This kept the room warmer. You can see a fireplace over to the right and an insert stove. More generally speaking, we would call it a Pennsylvania stove or a Franklin stove, but it had baffles in it that would kick the heat back out, and the heat was more even that way. Notice that there is a door that leads right out onto the town square. This would have been David Wills' law office where he practiced law. He chose red for this room because red was the color of leadership, and he was a community leader. He was superintendent of schools at one point in Gettysburg. He was a judge after the Civil War. Most people called him Judge Wills in the 1870s and 80s. From this room, he also did all kinds of paperwork. Not only did he handle damage claims from the battle here, because he was a lawyer, he would have had a little sandwich board or shingle out in front of that door, inviting people to come in to handle their claims. But also, he was involved on the board of the bank, the Gettysburg Bank. In fact, he bought this house from them in 1859. And he was part of the committee that brought the railroad to Gettysburg. He was there at the ribbon cutting ceremony in 1858 at the train station nearby, which helped modernize the town by bringing in things from all over the country and giving the town a national flavor. Some of the furniture in his house came from Baltimore. We have receipts to that effect. And notice the gas lantern on the wall there. He helped bring gas lighting to people's houses and to the streets, which prior to Tesla and Edison later in the century and their electric lights, gas lighting was a sign of a modern town. So he had his hands in all kinds of things to David Wills. This would have been his space where he worked on those things. We have an account of him practicing law here with his son-in-law in rather 1894, when he didn't feel well and he went into the other room, the parlor, and sat down on a couch, the newspaper said, and died shortly thereafter. So he died this would have been 31 years after Lincoln visited him. But Lincoln, we know of a couple of rooms that he visited, and I'll talk about that. But it's tempting to think he came into this room because Lincoln had practiced law. It certainly would have been something that he and David Wills would have been able to talk about. It was from this room that David Wills would have written a letter to Lincoln inviting him to come and deliver a few appropriate remarks at Gettysburg. And this is the table. The Park Service recreates the setting where he did his work there with a table in the middle of the room. Now we go to the upstairs. You can see the York Street entrance, but we're going to move up to the upstairs. You see Legacy Gallery 6 on the left, and on the right you see Gallery 4, and then you see the Lincoln bedroom in the upper right-hand corner. Because you're watching this video on your computer, you can just back up and take a look at this map anytime you like. It's very useful to help you get around. But see the stairs? We're going to go up those stairs now. Stairs are in the center, upper center. Now off to the left of the frame that you just saw, and really if you're taking the stairs, it would be off to the right, which would be to the east, is one bedroom, and we have multimedia programs there today. That's on the second floor. But the father-in-law, that is Catherine's father-in-law, may very well have stayed there and slept there. The children likely would have slept on the third floor. Typically, the children would be on the upper levels. And then there was a drawing or a sitting room or a morning room, which you could also loosely call a parlor. It was adjacent to where Lincoln would sleep, and we're going to look at that room next. But you can see that it's painted blue. Victorians were very careful to choose colors for a room to establish a mood. So red would establish community leadership. Blue would represent loyalty and friendship and trustworthiness, and that would make guests feel very welcome. Notice I called it a drawing, sitting, or morning room. If we look at Jenny Wills Quimby, one of the daughters' drawings for what was in each room in terms of furnishings, she had this room set up as a room with a sewing cabinet, a bookcase with books, a couch, chairs in the corners, and a center table. And she called it a living room. Well, living room is a 20th century term. It's not a Victorian term. The three terms I have, drawing room, sitting room, morning room, are more precise to that time period. And now, drawing room doesn't mean that you would go into the room to draw. It means that you withdrew from some other place. So let's say you're talking with your guest in the dining room, and things are getting a little too loud from people that are sharing the same space. So you tell two or three of your friends, hey, let's withdraw upstairs. So it would be another parlor or a withdrawing room or a sitting room. Lincoln was familiar with sitting rooms. He had one beside his bedroom in the White House. And it's where you sit when you get up in the morning to kind of wake up. You climb out of bed and then you go into the next room and just sit up. And a morning room is also can be called a sunning room or a sunroom. It's where the morning light comes in and where you wake up. And so Lincoln would have had to go through this room to get to the bedroom, presumably. Here's another angle. And notice over in the corner, right-hand corner, we're going to go through that entrance now, that door. And that leads us into the last room of visiting the Wills house where Lincoln stayed, the actual bedroom where he stayed. And if you visit the Wills house, this is the ultimate landing spot in your visit, a Lincoln bedroom. And careful attention has been given to try to recreate what the room was like. Samples have been taken from the walls from the wallpaper. It's been scraped all the way down. And so there very well may have been, if we have the era right, yellow wallpaper. And, yellow in a positive sense would uh, cause people to feel very upbeat, and it was very good for the morale and very inviting and very warm. And this was Catherine's bedroom, so she let Lincoln stay in her room. She gave him her room. The rest of the house had 38 people, and they were just crammed in various places all over the house. But Lincoln had his own bedroom, thanks to Catherine loaning it to him. And you can see that there's a chair off to the left and a table. David Wills gave public statements, official statements that were notarized before his death, so there would be a record, public record of Lincoln's stay. And he said that Lincoln was sitting in a chair at a table at one point, writing on a piece of paper. And so that's been recreated. You can see a water basin over in the corner where he would wash his hands in a rocking chair. And there's a bureau, a little box on the floor that you would put coals in or warm bricks so you could warm your feet. The house also had, or the room also had, a nice wood stove in it, an iron insert stove. There's the bureau on the floor. Now, the bed is original. Not only the frame, it's called Rococo architecture, but the bedspread is original as well. And all the furnishings in this room are original to the house. So one or more or several of these items may have actually been in this room, but they were original to the house. And they've been put in this room to recreate the scene of Lincoln's stay. Now, Lincoln completed the Gettysburg Address in the Wills house. David Wills, not long before his death, filled out an official record of what happened the night before Lincoln spoke. He said Lincoln withdrew there ultimately. He said that Lincoln ate in the dining room, and then Lincoln went to both parlors, or he said parlors, plural, so we presume more than one parlor. That would be the one downstairs that I showed you first, and that could have included the sitting or withdrawing room that I just showed you second. And it said that the children were running around the house, and there were a lot of people. He interacted with everyone, and then eventually he went into the bedroom. And David Wills said when he walked into the room at one point, Lincoln had a piece of paper that he was writing on. He said it was the same piece of paper he saw in his hand the next day when he gave the Gettysburg Address. He also said that Willie, an African American paid servant, came to him on behalf of Lincoln, who was with Lincoln when Lincoln visited Gettysburg. Willie came and found him and said, "The president needs to speak to you." David Wills walked in, and Lincoln said, "What can I help you with?" Wills said, "What can I help you with?" And Lincoln said, "Can you go over with me again tomorrow what you expect?" Because Wills had planned the whole ceremony and had invited all the participants. So Wills presumably told him, "You're to deliver a few appropriate remarks, that Ed Everett's going to be the main speaker, that there are going to be bands playing, that there's special poetry being read." And he would have gone over the ceremony agenda with him. And so Lincoln, then that was the Lincoln room. And now if you go back downstairs to the parlor, there's a wonderful model there. And so we're looking at the model of the town. And we'll say this: life in a mid-19th century northern Pennsylvania town is characterized by the following. One, a town square. Pennsylvania towns had town squares. Thanks to William Penn and Thomas Penn, who established a number of towns in Pennsylvania with squares. It's an English concept. You've heard of Trafalgar Square in England, or Piccadilly Square. And even other parts of the world have squares, like Red Square in Moscow, or Tiananmen Square in China. A square is an area where people come together to socialize, where there are open markets, where there are concerts, where there's all kinds of trade. And so the town square today is more of a traffic circle thanks to the automobile. But originally it would have been called a square, and sometimes they called it a diamond. But if you went to Lancaster, Reading, Philadelphia, I mean, think of Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. Any number of these towns, Chambersburg, you're going to find squares. And so Gettysburg had that typical William Penn, Thomas Penn square. The town also would have had the typical Roman grid. A grid denotes hierarchy. The Romans originally set up military camps in antiquity where they would create these strict grids, and they would put flags on each dirt street that they created where there were tents set up. And the flags became the inspiration for street signs later on. And the generals would have their headquarters at the very head of or the front of the grid that was set up with all of these hundreds of tents. It was set up like a checkerboard design. So the grid system is meant to have at the front, that's where leadership is. And so your courthouse originally would have been there at the town square, but only a couple blocks away by the time of the Civil War. And then people with the most prestige and the biggest houses and the most influence in the town, and the hotels with the most people that would attend, and businesses that drew the most customers, they tried to be in the center of town, in the front of town, like the general at the front of a Roman grid military camp. Now, let's talk about Henry Clay's American system at this point. The Henry Clay American system. One of the themes that we've been discussing is Lincoln visited Gettysburg, and Gettysburg was indicative of a national impulse. And we said one of those indicators was Victorian culture. So all throughout the US, there was a culture starting to permeate that was uniform across the country. Sometimes that culture is called antebellum, sometimes it's called sentimentalism, but more generally in the West, we call it Victorian culture. And it was a culture too signified by modernization. And that's another major theme of our presentation here today, is how Lincoln visited not only a flourishing culture that he could find just about anywhere, but he visited a town that was modernized. And that emanated from the Henry Clay American system. What do I mean by that? Well, in the 1830s, Henry Clay put forward a vision for how the country should develop, the new country. He said that the country should have high tariffs so that Americans would be less willing to buy foreign goods, and instead they would buy American. And so the idea of made in America was really emphasized. As part of that, if you bought American, that also promoted American industry. So he wanted to promote the development of railroads by the late 1830s, the development of macadamized roads, the telegraph, and factories, which would come about through the advent of the steam engine. Some parts of the country would have canals with steamboats. Ports would start to fill up with steam ships. Henry Clay wanted to invest in American infrastructure and build up America's economy. That's called the Henry Clay American system. It's all part of modernism and Gettysburg symbolized that when Lincoln visited it in a smaller way. Not as much as, let's say, Philadelphia or New York, but you could see modern characteristics in Gettysburg at the time of his visit. Gettysburg had a train station. Lincoln would arrive at that train station. That was completed in 1858, and there was a ribbon cutting ceremony. Many famous visitors came to Gettysburg on that train, none more famous than Lincoln. But this was part of the Henry Clay system to connect the country by railroad. The telegraph also connected the country in a very special way. People were able to communicate instantaneously. The rise of the stock market and stock exchange came about from telegraph. Knowledge is power. You could get information in New York that there was an unusually good wheat crop in Illinois. You could buy huge bundles of it via telegraph once you got that information, and then sell it in shares and make a lot of money that way. So the telegraph connected the world kind of like the internet does today. It took a lot of remote places and homogenized them. That's all part of modernization and the beginnings of nationalism, which was the connecting of the country through technology, through railroad, through telegraph. Macadamized roads was part of the American system, and Gettysburg participated in that. It was part of the American system. And this is Chambersburg Road. You can see the gravel. So there would have been a grade, a scraping, and a mixing of quarried rock from the various quarries in the area. Gettysburg had several improved roads, along with a railroad and telegraph. This helped there be a Lutheran theological seminary. The oldest Lutheran seminary in the country is the one at Gettysburg, and it's still there. It's a flourishing campus. But again, this is an outgrowth of transportation and communication improvements, which were common with the first industrial revolution or the first transportation communication system of the pre-Civil War times. And you can see Pennsylvania College, which would come to be known as Gettysburg College. It's also part of the outgrowth of modernization, transportation, communication, which Gettysburg enjoyed. Brick kilns, that was modernization because it cut down on fires to have brick houses. And so Gettysburg, around the town square, increasingly had more and more brick houses thanks to brick kilns. There were dams. There was Brames Mill and McAllister Mill on Marsh Creek and Rock Creek, respectively. These mills operated on water power. By the early 1900s, they were somewhat obsolete because increasingly everything operated on electrical power, and if you didn't have significant amount of money to upgrade, then your mill would go out of business. That probably contributed to McAllister Mill going out of business in the early 1900s. But there would have been mills that produced, they would take grains of corn and ground them down into flour, and the flour would be cornmeal, or they would do that with granules of wheat and turn it into flour. The miller who ground it for you with these stone discs, they were powered by water mills and axles and pulleys and so forth. They would keep 1/10 or one burlap bag of flour and then give you the other 9/10 back. And so that's how the mills operated in Gettysburg. There was the Rupp House Tannery on Baltimore Street. See the smokestack there. The smokestack is always a symbol of industry. There would have been smokestacks around the brick kilns as well. Smokestacks is a recognition that there are fumes, and you need to put the fumes out above the level spaces, ground level spaces where people are trying to breathe. So Gettysburg had low-grade industry. That's all part of modernization. It was an outgrowth of the first transportation communication revolution. Furnaces certainly are part of the American system. There were over 600 iron furnaces in Pennsylvania in 1860. Pennsylvania produced iron like later on Pittsburgh would produce steel. So when the Confederates came past that iron furnace, they burned it. Thaddeus Stevens pushed hard for tariffs. The South wanted low tariffs because they didn't have much industry and they depended on importing and exporting. High tariffs hurt their ability to trade with foreign countries and made them buy Pennsylvania goods. Lincoln addressed the people at Hanover Junction on November 18th, 1863, on his way to Gettysburg. He arrived in Gettysburg around 6 p.m. and he stopped in Hanover, and someone gave him an explanation on how General Custer and Judson Kilpatrick had come through there during the Battle of Gettysburg, and he waved at the townspeople and then continued on. Remember now, the train is all part of modernization, transportation, communication revolution. It's also part of bringing Victorian culture. It's part of the national impulse that we're overall talking about here today, the national impulse of rail connected, isolated places and brought to these places a national flavor. Furniture, wallpaper, floor covering, cabinets, tables, troops that would come and perform, bands that would play. And Lincoln's visit in and of itself represents that national impulse. It was not common for a president to leave Washington, D.C. and to go to a battlefield. Railroads made that possible. And Lincoln was one of the first, if not the first president, to ever go that far from Washington by train to give a speech. That's all part of modernization and the rise of the national impulse. And Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg to throngs of people that met him at the train station. You saw that in an earlier slide. You can see that over to the right. You can see Lincoln with his top hat there in the crowd. We're going to meet some of those people in the crowd here very shortly. Then Lincoln walked from the train station up to the town square to the Wills House. There were 8 governors, 2 former governors and 6 current governors with him. Also, Andrew Curtin, the governor of Pennsylvania, was one of those governors, along with William Seward, the Secretary of State, would have been with him. And you can see civilians all around. Such a beautiful painting. Now, I only have this map once for you to see in this presentation, so you'll want to scroll back to it from time to time. But just generally speaking, as we get to know some of those townspeople that you saw in the crowd, notice 3 roads going east-west: Chambersburg Street, below that West Middle Street, below that West High Street, and they're eastern versions of all 3. Notice York Street is an extension of Chambersburg Street there at the top. Now, intersecting north-south are 2 primary streets: Washington Street on your left, Baltimore Street on your right. So try to remember that as we look at these houses. Feel free to stop and scroll back to this map as we get to know the people in the crowd that you saw from the previous slide. This is John Burns. He was a cobbler and town constable. He lived on Chambersburg Street. He carried his flint musket to the front lines on July 1st, 1863, to fight with the Iron Brigade on McPherson Ridge. Lincoln sat with him for a special service at the Presbyterian Church before his return on November 19th, 1863. John Burns lived at the juncture of Chambersburg Street and Springs Avenue, and you can visit that today. You can visit that area today. The original house is no longer there. You can see Burns sitting on the porch. There is a house there at that corner today. It is a white house, but it faces in a different direction. Mary Thompson is another one of those civilians that may have been in the crowd from the previous painting that you saw. She raised 8 children. Her house served as an extension of Robert E. Lee's headquarters on Chambersburg Street. She did not want the rebel leader there. Even so, she expressed that Lee acted the gentleman. But several of his attendants stole and were generally destructive. She refused to leave during the battle. Mary, her daughter-in-law, with 2 children, likely sheltered in the cellar. This is the Mary Thompson house after the battle. It's beautifully restored today. Civil War Trust and the National Park Service have gone in together on the Civil War Trust, have purchased it for the Park Service. At some point, when boundaries are adjusted, it'll be within the Park Service's ability to open it. The Mary McAllister house. Mary McAllister lived on Chambersburg Street, North Side, and operated a small store there. She assisted the surgeons in Christ Lutheran Church. She had quite an encounter with Colonel Henry A. Morrow, 24th Michigan, Dennis B. Daly, 2nd Wisconsin, and General James Archer's sword. Okay, so she hid a sword, she hid a wallet, and there would be attempts to recover those items as these individuals would revisit. She watched a surgeon cut off 7 fingers of a boy and saw them fall down. She had trouble crossing the street. She said it was almost like a river. If you go into a river and it's so strong it carries you way downstream before you finally get across. The crowds were so thick of Union soldiers falling back through the town, back to the heights of Cemetery Hill on the first day of the battle, that when she tried to cross, she got caught up in those blue, that sea of blue uniforms, almost like getting caught up in a heavy current. She sat with her family by the upstairs window at night. Sarah Sally Broadhead, she lived on Chambersburg Street, North Side, with her husband, Joseph, and their 4-year-old daughter, Mary. She was a teacher and author of Diary of a Lady of Gettysburg. She and her husband took cover in the cellar of their house, cared for 3 wounded soldiers there. She wrote, "No one can imagine the extreme fright when our men began to retreat on July 1st. Of the picket's charge cannonade, she stated, quote, as if heaven and earth were crashing together. She moved to Linwood, New Jersey in 1885. Now, I may have mentioned this earlier, but it's important to repeat again if I haven't, that these pictures came from the National Park Service archives, the Gettysburg National Military Park Library. And they were many of these photos, part of the Wall of Faces at Gettysburg. And if you went to the old visitor center many years ago and you walked in off of Tawnytown Road and you walked past the bookstore on your left and the ranger desk on your right, you entered this room and it was covered with images on 3 sides of soldiers, and on the back wall were civilians. And so these photographs came to the into the park in the 1990s from the Adams County Historical Society. So you can go there and find extensive files as well as these images. And the Park Service has copies at Gettysburg National Military Park. This is Professor Michael Jacobs. He lived on West Middle Street. He taught mathematics and natural science at Gettysburg College. He recorded the temperature for the first day of the battle, July 1st, 1863. He dismissed class early, telling his class, this is on July 1st, we will close and see what is going on, for you know nothing about the lesson anyhow. He was teaching in front of the class when the battle started, and the students kept looking out the window. So he finally just stopped the lecture. He said, you're not listening anyway. He told his son, Henry, who was 9 years old, during Pickett's charge, quick, come. You can see now what in your life you will never see again. He apparently took a scope, we would call it a telescope today, home with him after he canceled his lecture on July 1st. And he and his son went to the attic, and there's an observatory there up on the roof. And he put up his scope and looked through it and saw Pickett's charge just as the troops were making their left oblique. Henry Jacobs, his son, was 9 years old at the time, and he looked into the what we would call a telescope, and he wrote about it years later when he published a book. He said, I saw Pickett's troops just as they were swinging around. Another person that was in the crowd that you saw when Lincoln was standing at the train station, who very well could have been in that crowd, was Daniel J. Skelly. He lived on West Middle Street. He was a dry goods clerk at Fonstock Brothers Firm. He directed Major Oliver O. Howard to the building's observatory on July 1st, 1863. He wrote a book, A Boy's Experiences During the Battle of Gettysburg. He and 2 friends used a handcart to travel from Hanover toward Gettysburg on June 27th, had to walk remaining 10 miles from a burned bridge at Conewago Creek. Of July 1st, the first day of the battle, he said, I climbed up a good-sized oak tree. Shot and shell began to fly, passing dangerously near the top of the tree. There was a general stampede toward town. A cannonball quickened my pace. This is Daniel Skelly. And by the way, the Fondstock building, you can visit it there today. There's some law offices. It's on Baltimore Street, and it's a beautifully restored multi-story building. The Power Sisters, they were in their 20s at the time of the battle. This was taken later. All of them were school teachers. They lived on the northeast corner of South Washington and High Street. And you can see in the back left, Lydia Powers Tipton, then Jane Powers McDonald, Alice Powers. Front left, you can see Mary Powers Flaherty and Virginia Powers Smith. Each cared for wounded in their home cellar. It was damp from all the post-battle rain. It rained heavily for 2 days after the battle. It rained heavily after a lot of Civil War battles, possibly because this is the era before smokeless gunpowder, about 30 years. And so the smoke may very well have interfered with the Earth's atmosphere and caused these major downpours. But the basements collected water. We know that something like 100 people died in Adams County within a year after the war, and maybe upwards of 60 died prematurely. So they could have been affected by all kinds of ailments from polluted water and polluted air. Virginia nursed a Captain Reynolds back to health who visited her after the war and wanted to marry her, but Virginia had already engaged. That's the Power Sisters. And then Elizabeth Salome Sally Myers. She lived on West High Street. She was the daughter of Peter Myers, Justice of Peace, and Mother Mary. Sally was a school teacher since age 16. She was in her 4th week of school vacation when the battle began. 40 years after the battle, she wrote, how a Gettysburg school teacher spent her vacation in 1863. Sergeant Alexander Stewart, 149th Pennsylvania, they were the Pennsylvania Bucktails, was shot through the lungs, legs paralyzed, and died in Sally's care in the Catholic Church on July 6th. There's another account that suggests that he actually died in her home, so perhaps he had been moved by that point. But Alexander Stewart was in her care. Before Alexander died, Sally read a Bible chapter to him that his father had read before he left. His father made a trip to Gettysburg to retrieve the body weeks later. The father, mother, and other son, Henry, returned a year later. This was again, they made another trip back with their son. Sally and the other son, Henry, became fond of each other and married in 1867. But Henry died in less than a year. But they had a son. Their son was born a month after his death. That's the school teacher, Elizabeth Sally Myers. And this is her house on West High Street. And this is St. Francis Xavier Church, where she cared for him at least for a period of time. And then there was Mary Virginia Jenny Wade. She lived on South Street. Jenny and her mother were seamstresses, shot while baking bread and caring for her sister Georgia, who was nursing an infant. This is the Jenny Wade House, and you can visit today. It's a wonderfully run local business and a must-see on your tour at Gettysburg. There was so much heavy sharpshooting in the town that to take her body out of the house, they couldn't risk taking her out one of the doors. So on the reverse side of the roof of this house, on the other side of that chimney, a hole was cut into the roof, and her body was taken up out of the roof so she would be out of the line of sight of sharpshooters to your left in the town. John Jack Hopkins, he lived on South Washington Street. John was an employee at Gettysburg College and known for his integrity and commanding a general confidence. He and family fled their campus home, which was ransacked. Shortly afterwards, his son, Sergeant John Edward Hopkins, enlisted in the United States Colored Troops. So his son would have been one of those 180,000 African Americans that fought for their freedom. Matilda Jane Tilly Pierce. She lived on Baltimore Street with her father, James Pierce, a butcher, on the first floor. Mother, Margaret A. McCurdy Pierce, was there as well. Brothers James William, sister Margaret, and two others. Tilly wrote a book, At Gettysburg, or What a Girl Saw and Heard of the Battle, a true narrative. She went with Mrs. Shriver to the Jacob Weichert farm, ironically near the Round Tops, hoping to escape the battle. She brought water from a spring to Union soldiers. She witnessed, quote, surgeons hastily administering chloroform along with soldiers shrieking with pain, and noticed a pile of limbs higher the fence, trophies of the amputating bench. This is Tilly Pierce. And you can go past the Tilly Pierce House and Inn on Baltimore Street, a wonderful establishment. And not far from it is the George and Hetty Shriver House. They had two children, Sadie, 5, and Molly, 3 years old. They were the ones that took Tilly Pierce down to the Round Tops, to the Weichert House, to get away from the battle. And little did they know, Little Round Top would be the scene of some of the fiercest fighting of the war the following day. Now, Nancy Goodmestead owns this house today and operates it as a museum. It's a must-see when you visit Gettysburg. It's beautifully restored Victorian house. My goodness. Anna Garlick Kitzmiller. She lived on Baltimore Street with her baby brother William, her mother Catherine, and father John Henry. Her father was a carpenter who made furniture and caskets. Her father walked to Cemetery Hill to get a view of the retreat on the first day of the battle and became cut off from returning home. Anna and family took cover in the cellar by day and came upstairs to prepare meals by night. On July 4th, she observed Brigadier General Alexander Schimmelpfennig walking stiff and cramped from an alley towards some soldiers in blue. He was a general that hid in a small shed structure behind her house. He got cut off during the retreat through the town back to Cemetery Hill. Her mother would feed him. That's the John Henry and Catherine Garlick house. Anna lived here. That's where he made caskets and furniture for the town. It's not far from the National Cemetery. This is Josephine Rogers Miller. She lived on the Rogers farm along Emmitsburg Road, but is photographed here in front of the Lydia Leister house. That would be General Meade's headquarters. She tended to many wounded. 17 died in her cellar. She baked bread and served soldiers throughout the battle, even during Pickett's charge. I mean, during the Pickett's charge, you could smell fresh baked bread going out across the field. She returned 25 years later, expenses paid, to a Gettysburg reunion. It was a Massachusetts regiment that paid for her to be there for that reunion. She also received a gold badge for helping the wounded. She cooked a meal for General Sickles, formerly of the 3rd Corps, during her visit 25 years later. Peter and Elizabeth Catherine Masser Thorne were caretakers in the Evergreen Cemetery. Technically, that's where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, and that's where the famous Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse stands today, the most iconic structure in Gettysburg. They were immigrants from Germany and married in Gettysburg in 1855. They had 3 sons by 1861. Elizabeth's parents lived in the gatehouse with them. Peter enlisted in the 138th Pennsylvania and was stationed in the broader theater of war guarding Washington, D.C. Elizabeth cooked a meal for Major Generals Howard, Slocum, and Hancock. She familiarized Howard with roads and the area. Elizabeth helped with the burial of over 100 graves in the July heat and humidity. Blood-stained mattresses and pillows from Germany that they had brought all the way over from Germany had to be boiled and wrung or burned. She was 6 months pregnant at the time of the battle. Her baby was named Rose Meade Thorne, naming him after the commanding general of the Union Army. Peter returned after Appomattox. That's the last battle of the war, the place where Lee surrendered. Elizabeth had internal physical troubles for years, from helping to bury all the dead while 6 months pregnant. This is the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse, the Gardner photo. Henry J. Stahl is another person that would have been in the crowd, quite possibly in the crowd from the painting that I showed depicting that crowd earlier when Lincoln visited. He lived on Baltimore Street. He was the Democratic compiler, editor, and publisher. Henry arranged for a Confederate doctor to enter his house and help a Union colonel, William Dudley. Stahl's political enemies wrongly reported him for conspiring with the enemy, and he was temporarily imprisoned at Fort McHenry, Maryland. So his operation of the Democratic Compiler newspaper led to his political foes implicating him wrongly, and he spent time in confinement at Fort McHenry, Maryland, but then was released and returned home. David Wills, we mentioned him earlier, so I don't want to be redundant, but you can see this slide here. Basil and Mrs. Mary Jackson Biggs, they had 7 children. They were tenants at the J. Crawford Farm. His home was used as part of the Underground Railroad. Basil was a veterinarian. He was contracted to help reinter the dead to the eventual National Cemetery. After the war, he owned the copse of trees that became central to the symbolic message of high water mark. Dr. John W.C. O'Neill lived at Baltimore and High Street, a Pennsylvania college student, Gettysburg College student, originally from Virginia. He cared for the wounded after Antietam. He also recorded Confederate burial sites to help the Confederate dead be located, as it turns out, years later and reinterred in Richmond, Virginia. Another person that played a major role in this was Dr. Rufus Weaver. He lived on West Middle Street, had a medical degree in 1865 with anatomy as his specialty. He worked an average 18 hours a day, labeling, arranging, and recording Confederate remains. From 1871 to 74, he facilitated 2,935 remains to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. So his anatomy background helped him be able to identify the soldiers and to document them so they could be reinterred. Solomon Powers, he lived on the northeast corner of South Washington and High Street. He was a granite cutter, had a granite yard next to his house on Washington and High Street. He could be blunt, unpretentious, but also compassionate and giving, as were his daughters who cared for the wounded in their house. Remember, we saw the picture of the Solomon or the Power sisters earlier? Those were his daughters. Powers Hill is named after him. Powers Hill was General Slocum's headquarters during the battle. Charles Tyson, he lived on Chambersburg Street. He actually lived in that Tyson's Wills house I showed you at the beginning of this presentation, right next to the Wills home, their primary residence. He had a photography studio that he rented from David Wills on York Street. A shell hit his studio, leaving a mark still visible. Many Union soldiers crowded into his studio. He photographed battlefield views, landmarks, and the cemetery dedication. On June 26th, mounted men dashed past his house with yells while discharging their carbines and pistols in the air. So he would have seen White's Comanches of Virginia Confederate cavalrymen come through 5 days before the main battle, right in front of not far from his house in the town square. Sadie Bushman Jungleman, she lived in the George Bushman farm on Rock Creek. A shell grazed her skirt, staggering her with a concussion. An Army doctor remarked, "That was a close call," and led her to a field hospital where he said, "Give that soldier water while I cut off his leg." She met that doctor again many years later in California. Reverend Amos Moser Whetstone, he lived on Chambersburg Street. He was a Lutheran seminary student. He was sitting on a back porch on July 4th when Sally Myers saw him. She warned, "Take care, you will be shot." About the same time, Amos looked down at his leg and remarked, "Oh, I believe I am shot." He survived to eventually become director of the Lutheran Theological Seminary. Now we're in the last phase of our presentation. You've gotten to meet townspeople who may very well have been in the crowds that saw Lincoln when he arrived at the train station. At least some of them were, if not all of them. And you can now see the town square or the diamond where everyone gathered for the funeral procession that Lincoln was there for, that would lead to the cemetery where his famous speech would help dedicate what would become the Soldiers' National Cemetery. And so that's the town square. We saw it a little earlier. Notice the Will's house is painted gray. It would have actually been brick, red brick at the time. And then this is from the town square, this view looking south down Baltimore Street. That's the route that the procession took. Now, the procession included, there were three bands: the 9th New York Heavy Artillery Band. There was also a Marine Band, and then the Birchfield Band. And they played music, at least one or more of them did, between 10 and 10:30 on November 19th, 1863 in the morning, to distract the crowds who wondered why the procession didn't start at 10 o'clock. There were thousands of people gathered and lined on either side of Baltimore Street, which you're looking down, waiting for the procession to go through. Not only were there these three bands, but the Masons were there in their colorful dress. There were a number of dignitaries. I mentioned earlier, 6 current governors, 2 former governors. Secretary of State was there. Edward Everett, the keynote speaker and former president of Harvard, was there. And you would have seen the Baltimore Glee Club, who sang in 4-part harmony. And many, many other guests were there, and there were just throngs of people. The procession didn't start right at 10 o'clock like it was supposed to, because Ed Everett went out one more time around the battlefield with a battle participant who was there and offered to take him around. And Ed Everett was known as very, very particular with his facts and getting everything straight. And so it caused him to show up a little late. The bands played to distract people. Lincoln was on a horse that was a little bit giddy. I mean, it would jump around, and he was not a good horse rider anyway. And there was some worry that he wouldn't be able to keep the horse in line during the very slow procession. So they traded up horses. By the way, Lincoln apparently smiled, borderline laughed when the horse was so jittery. And it caused some people to notice that and remember it was the only time that they saw him smile while he was at Gettysburg. But in any case, they traded up a smaller horse, and he was tall and his legs nearly touched the ground. And so one of the newspapers said that they made overtures of the biblical story of Christ and riding on a colt into Jerusalem. And but then another newspaper just said Lincoln was too tall for the horse. But anyway, that's one of the remembrances of the time. Eventually, everyone lined up, and the procession started about 10:30 on November 19th, 1863, down the street that you're looking, Baltimore Street. Now, this is Baltimore Street looking 180 degrees opposite. The town square would be in the background, and they're marching towards you. You can see the crowds all around. There was the 9th New York Heavy Artillery Band was out front. Lincoln and the dignitaries were on horseback there. And then there was also about 800 soldiers with fixed bayonet marching. There was some artillery following and cavalry. As I've mentioned, there were men on horseback to represent cavalry. So you had all three branches of the military there. And this is Baltimore Street. See the smokestack on your left from the Rupp Tannery. Here's a close-up of the procession. See the gleaming bayonets? It's estimated there were 15 to 20,000 people there. And we look at the Larry Selman painting called We Have Come to Dedicate. This is a painting to show, to recreate an image that never developed. There was a photographer who set up a camera right from the direction that you're viewing and took a picture. Well, the lapse time on photographs were so slow at that time that it was almost impossible to take a moving image picture. And if you look at photographs in the 1850s, 1860s, they're almost always taken when everything is still. Like pictures of downtown Boston, New York City, Philadelphia are almost always taken on a Sunday when businesses are closed and no one's there, because if anything moves, there's a blur in the picture. The reason photographers came to photograph the dead in the battlefield after a battle is because they couldn't take action shots. Well, this one photographer decided to give it a try. And after the picture developed, there was nothing there. So apparently the shot snapped after Lincoln and the dignitaries had passed. And the only thing that shows in the image is a small sycamore tree, and it's still there today. And you can see that Selman has shown it in the foreground. But we can see Lincoln and the dignitaries on horseback, Andrew Curtin, presumably of Pennsylvania, along with several other governors, and Seward, the Secretary of State, and Edward Everett and so forth. There they are going by. Let's say something briefly about the clothing of the folks that we've talked so much about. Victorian clothing. Well, Victorians tended to wear dark colors. I mean, there were exceptions, but a lot of men in particular wore browns and blacks. And that's because this is all a representation of what happens after monarchies are toppled. All throughout Europe in the late 1700s and early 1800s, monarchies were toppled in favor of modern governments that had constitutions and had rule of law and had elected officials and had human rights as a basis to protect people's individual rights. And that, with the removal of monarchies, there was a power vacuum. And so men in a patriarchal society largely filled that as businessmen and community leaders, and they wore black to appear serious all the time. So you would take them serious, and that there would be a guard against anarchy, if you will. Now, the reason they wore tall hats is because everyone wore dark clothing. The only variation in your clothing was how tall your hat was, or how nice a pin you had on your lapel. But you can see that as they go by in their seriousness. Victorian culture emphasized seriousness, and women wore crinolines. Crinolines caused the dress to extend out, and they would wear corsets, and so women would have this hourglass design, and it was so that they would appear almost like Lady Liberty. Women were seen as keeper of virtues. They raised children in the home before public schools, which were not common until the 1890s. And so women taught virtues, honesty, patience, courage, truth, justice, hospitality, honesty, all the things that you want to pass on to someone that would make them better citizens. So women were seen as the key, the glue to democracy, because they trained up children in the home to carry on. Democracies depend on people having internal restraints, an internal compass, and that comes from having those ideas planted in them from an early age. So women had to dress almost like China dolls. The idea is, if a woman fell, the republic fell. And the concept of the Republican mother in the late 1700s and eventually Lady Liberty evolved out of this. Now we're to the cemetery, and you can see the design of it. Notice the elliptical fan window. I mentioned that earlier in the vestibule of the Wills house. I said, don't forget the elliptical fan, the Federalist architecture elliptical fan, because it'll factor in again at the end. The cemetery, which is now the National Cemetery, one of the first national cemeteries in the country. National cemeteries are an outgrowth of the Civil War from all of the deaths. and as a proper way to mourn the death. But you'll notice it's based on a federalist design. And so there could be some subliminal statements here about this was a federal government, and a federal government recognizes all levels of government as having a certain amount of autonomy: local government, state government, and national government. And the three are a compact, if you will. Now, nationalism and national governments, which Lincoln talks about in the Gettysburg Address, actually has more to do with consolidation of local and state into a strong federal head, which we would call nationalism. So maybe there's some communication going on here between a federal government and a national government. We know, though, that even though Southerners emphasized states' rights, so did Northerners. The designer of the cemetery, William Saunders, he was an egalitarian, and that is, he wanted full equality under the law, regardless of gender, ethnicity, class, which we all look at today as a no-brainer, but at that time, he was ahead of his time. He did not even want separate plots for the 17 northern states represented here. He didn't want Wisconsin, New York, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Maine, Indiana to have separate plots. He wanted them all to be buried side by side without a state designation. But those designations do kind of point more towards a federal government. And certainly there's a great resemblance between the design and the Federalist design. There's something else too going on here too. I'll just throw this in to pique your interest. And that is, there is a likeness in the design of the National Cemetery to a Greek amphitheater. And a Greek amphitheater is a symbol of democracy. Why? Because only democracies have theaters. Theaters tend to have satire, and they poke fun at political leaders, and you can't do that in the dictatorship. So one of the symbols of democracy is an amphitheater. So think of this as an amphitheater of the dead, and think of the orchestra, which is the center. That's the stage. And on the stage, there's a monument there called the Soldiers' National Monument. Well, in ancient Greek theaters, the stage was called the orchestra. An orchestra would be there today. Now, here's the only picture that turned out showing Lincoln up close. And it's a picture looking from east to west. And in the background, a flag. Presumably, that's the flag where the Soldiers' National Monument is today. The crowds, 15 to 20,000 people, ironically, many of them are buried today where their tombstones are today. When I go and look at the local Evergreen Cemetery where Lincoln spoke and where the crowd stood, I think it's a powerful thought to think, as you look at all of those upright marble stones, to think that that could have been where that person actually stood when Lincoln spoke. But where that upright flag is in the background, that's where the Soldiers' National Monument is today, in the middle of that elliptical fan design that I showed you. And as Lincoln is sitting down, he's just taking his hat off. He's presumably just finished his Gettysburg Address, and you can see the moisture in his hair has matted his hair a little bit. And that may be Layman Ward, who was his bodyguard, walking from right to left in the picture. And then that would be in the center, about ready to eclipse your view of Lincoln from right to left. Then way over the far right is possibly Governor Andrew Curtin. And then the older figure with the bow tie, who's blurred a little bit, that could be Edward Everett, who was the keynote speaker, but that's my best guess. I've tried to analyze it, and I've talked with people that I respect to see if I could nail down each of these images, and I found that it's really hard to do that. That's Lincoln after he gave the speech. Now, Lincoln captured the moment in speaking on November 19th, 1863, through the idea of life cycle. And what do we mean by life cycle? Well, everything about his speech is based on the idea, like the seasons, there's new life in spring, there's maturation of life in summer, there's twilight years of fall, there's death in winter, and then new life again in spring. So there's this carousel of a life cycle. And if you want to understand Lincoln's address, understand that it's based on the life cycle. When he said 7 ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He could have just said 87 years ago, the Declaration of Independence was signed, declaring all men are created equal. But he said 7. Why? Psalms chapter 90, verse 10 says that a person's lifespan is 70. If by reason they live 80, they will soon fly away. Lincoln was suggesting the country had lived a full lifespan by 1863, 87 years or 7. He said, our fathers brought forth, well, this is a picture of the signers of the Declaration, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Adams, Hamilton. And our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty. Well, this is Lady Liberty. There was a Lady Britannia at the time, a Lady Germania, Mary Anne in France, who was a symbol for the revolution in 1830. And then eventually there was Lady Liberty at Ellis Island in 1886 in New York. But there were many variations on Lady Liberty up to that point. I made a reference to her earlier, but if you go to battlefields today, you'll see Lady Liberties on them. And there, she was a symbol of virtue, kind of a face to put all of these higher truths of justice and truth and honesty and perseverance and will and determination. We went through those a little bit earlier, hospitality. Lincoln's picture here is our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty. So our fathers bring forth, and with liberty they have a child. All men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived, there's your life cycle again, so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to visit a final resting place. In the life cycle, this is a moment where everything's come to a dramatic pause, where the country's already lived a full lifespan of 7. Will they fly away, or what will they do? Well, he doesn't leave people in that moment of despair and wandering. He gives them a vision forward, a new birth. It is rather for us here to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And it's here that we see the life cycle. There's a new birth that he calls for, but it's not in liberty. The original birth was conceived in liberty. It lived 7, a full lifespan. The new birth that he calls for to rise up out of the ashes, like a phoenix out of the ashes. This new birth is not of liberty, but of freedom. And Lincoln, 2 weeks after his Gettysburg Address, dedicated Lady Freedom at the Capitol in Washington. He knew it was there. It was being worked on. It was being prepared. It may have been in his mind at that point, but he used the word freedom for the new birth rather than liberty. And a number of the African-American leaders, Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and others, have been talking publicly about the difference between liberty and freedom. Freedom was a better way to go forward with the new birth, because what's the difference? Well, liberty are your basic rights. Think of the Bill of Rights, right to assemble, freedom of speech, the press, religion, right to bear arms, right to a jury, presumed innocent till proven guilty, right to life, liberty, and property, right and later on amendments, a right to vote without literacy tests and poll taxes, an abolition to slavery, abolition to debtor's prison, abolition to public displays of capital punishment. These are all ideas out of the Enlightenment, and they are all rights, and the country was founded on those rights. They're spelled out, most of them, in the original Bill of Rights. The country lived 7 years on those rights. The problem is with some people's rights or liberties or rights can infringe on other people's rights and rob them of their rights and thus rob them of freedom. So for instance, you can have a right to freedom of speech, but you don't have a right to yell fire in a crowded theater, which infringes your right on their rights. Or you have a right to life, liberty, and property, says the Fifth Amendment, but you don't have a right to human property. And so freedom called for people to police their own actions with their own internal compass in such a way that their rights in the new birth wouldn't infringe on the greater freedom of the whole. So a new birth of freedom depended on everyone policing themselves better, so there would be more freedom going forward. And that idea of freedom has been with us ever since, that new birth of freedom. Out of death for a righteous cause comes a new birth. And Lincoln was saying they had given the last full measure, and they had done so for a righteous cause. And so the country should be dedicated to the task of bringing about a greater freedom. So with the death comes the new birth, and the new birth would be freedom. That's what was in exchange for the death. And so Lincoln's idea of freedom then is carried on at this point. One last point. The original birth was all men are created equal. That lasted 7 years. The new birth is of the, by the, for the people. It's a much wider umbrella. And we've been working out that concept all the way to this day. So as we wind down to conclude, Lincoln spoke in the language of modernism, Victorian culture, and nationalism. Modernism, Victorian culture, and nationalism. As we look at the Soldiers' National Monument and Lady Liberty, not far from where he spoke. Summary conclusion. In summary, life in a northern town revolved on the themes of modernism, Victorian culture, and nationalism. Lincoln's visit alone represented all three. In the first place, he was a former Whig who backed the American system that ushered in the transportation and communication with its macadamized roads, canals, steam trains, steam press, steamboats, steamships, and telegraph. Not only did all these advancements bring modern forms of communication, but they added a national flavor to formerly isolated and remote towns such as Gettysburg. That natural flavor included a common culture that we may call Victorian. However, modernism involved more than transportation, communication, and common culture. Most importantly, modernism meant democratic principles of liberty, equality, rule of law, human rights, and expanding freedom to all people, regardless of race, gender, or class, the very principles espoused by Lincoln in his famous Gettysburg Address. For 2 days in November 1863, these ideals were fully on display in the northern town of Gettysburg.